Kean University, and I'd like to thank you all for coming out today to celebrate African History Month with us. Today we have a very, very, very special speaker, and I'm sure it's going to be very informative. She's my sister. So we have a special presentation, and she's going to be speaking on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So we've dedicated the entirety of African History Month to the history legacy of SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So let me just read a little bit of her bio, and then we'll bring her up to the microphone, and we can begin because we're all running a little bit behind time. Dr. Marimba Ani has been involved in the African liberation movement since her work as a field organizer in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Mississippi from 1963 to 1966. In 1967, after having traveled to Africa, she began formal study of the nature of African civilization in the attempt to determine how the process of culture formation could be used to achieve sovereignty for African people on the continent and in the diaspora. Because of this commitment, she has become involved in the process of African-centered reconceptualization and the creation of African people, and the creation of a theoretical framework which will address the needs of African people to analyze phenomena from the perspective of their collective interests, values, and visions. Dr. Ani has, in this pursuit, created the African-centered theological concepts of Asili, Utamawazo, and Utamaroho. And, you have to excuse me, I'm having a difficult time seeing this, and the Maafa Sankofa paradigm as part of the endeavor to develop an African cultural science which will be pragmatic for the reconstruction of African civilization. The term Maafa was developed and presented in her book, Let the Circle Be Unbroken, in 1980, and has subsequently been embraced by the Pan-Africanist community worldwide to refer to the systematic attempt to destroy African civilization and to dominate and exploit African people through capture, transport, the Middle Passage, 300 years of chattel enslavement, and continuing cultural genocide. Introduction to the term Maafa has allowed African people of African descent to claim and define their own reality and their own terms. In addition to Marimba Ani's systematic critique of the European paradigm, demonstrates the anti-African nature of European thought and behavior. The following are a few of her scholarly works: The Ideology of European Dominance, European Mythology, The Ideology of Progress, Let the Circle Be Unbroken, and Uprooted, an African-centered critique of European cultural thought and behavior. So without further ado, Dr. Marimba Ani.
Another term we would use would be kiambote. We say, these are greetings in African languages, which we are beginning to study and to know. Thank you, Brother James, Dr. James Conyers, for having me here. Those of you who are here, I thank you for your time. And got a lot I want to do today. And I want to begin by establishing a frame of reference or context for understanding the work of the Southern student movement in general, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in particular. And so in order to do that, let's look at the people that we're talking about and really what are our ancestral antecedents. And so I begin by talking about or referring to what we call Ma'at. That's M-A-A-T. It's a concept that comes out of ancient Kemet. Some know that as Egypt. And actually it's a concept that we find in all African civilizations, but it is the concept of the moral order, the divine order, the order, the natural order that we as human beings want to emulate, we want to use as the ideal for structuring our society. And so we see this as our beginnings. This is how African civilization was formed. And I have this concept that I introduced in the book Ururu of Asili, which is the cultural seed. So we're saying that our cultural seed as African people begins there. Begins in Africa, which we know is the origins of humanity. And so the African Asili is born in Africa. These are the ancient antecedents of the movement that we will be talking about today, where we have the first organized societies, and there is a development of a particular worldview and conceptions of reality which we as African people carry within us in what we call deep structure of culture. And then we would move, so if we had more time, and this was a class we would talk about, and Dr. Conyers would help us do this, talk about, well, what dates would we be talking about if we're going back to these ancestral antecedents. So, and I'd get some guesses from you, but we end up with, what would we be talking about, James?
Going all the way back, we're talking about at least 3.5 million years.
Okay. I want to just give that sense of, we really need, when we talk about historical context, that's what we need to be talking about, okay? All right, then let's jump to maybe 15th century. And there is a term which is Maafa, M-A-A-F-A. That term literally comes from, or linguistically comes from Kiswahili, meaning great disaster. It also, however, comes from Bamana, which is spoken in Mali. In Kiswahili, Maafa is the great disaster. In Babana, Maafa, Ma'a is the divine, it is the divine origins of what is human, of humanity. Fa is to kill. And so Maafa would be to kill humanity, which I discovered only after I had used the term, the Kiswahili term. And so we use that term to claim an aspect of history or our story, and to define it in our terms. And so we refer to the period beginning around, somewhere around in the 15th century. I guess the Portuguese, others come into Africa, that then develops into the onslaught into Africa and the kidnapping of African people, the capturing of African people, which goes on into, well, the 17th century is when people are actually brought here in an enslaved condition. Of course, there is evidence of a prior contact of Africans with this part of the world. We're not talking about that right now. We're talking about the Middle Passage and the what came out of that. So what this does is that it takes us out of context, out of the context of Ma'at. It disrupts the order. The Maafa disrupts the continuity. It disrupts the connectedness. I say that it breaks the rhythm of Ma'at. It is a violent uprooting. And so this acelio, or this seed, is uprooted. It is a forced displacement. And we become a captured people. We become prisoners of war and remain prisoners of war. And so it is the most extreme culturally destructive act of intentional cultural genocide. Let me just do a few visual things. You can see here, this would represent the beginning of that process. The intrusion, being taken to the dungeons. This is the river in which we were bathed, they said, for the last time before going to the dungeon. And this would be the dungeon at Elmina. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on this, and I have many, many slides. This is all in the dungeons where our people were being kept before being taken to the ships for the Middle Passage. And there's a story that goes along with that. We don't have that kind of time today, but it is very important that people understand the historical background to what we call the movement of the 60s. And so here, going into the ships, then there is the creation of the so-called diaspora. And then we would move to a period, again, this is the background, very important background, to understanding the consciousness that developed in the 60s. And this would be, James helped me with this, I think in the 20s, 1920s, the lynchings. This, by the way, just want to share this with you. I think I can read it. This was a postcard. Have you shown this before, James? No? Okay. This postcard said, this is the barbecue we had last night. My picture is the one with the cross over it, your son, Joe. This is a period in U.S. history which is very important for people to understand, especially if they're going to understand the movement that I'm talking about. Also, if we are going to understand and put in context things that are happening today. I'm now living in Georgia, and we went to the prison where Troy Davis was executed, and that was recent. Actually standing across the road, waiting for word of what they were going to do, and at one point, our hopes got up that they were, I think there was a stay. We thought there was a stay of execution, and it turned out that they just executed him hours later. Okay, I'm gonna, here's the person. This can come off now, or actually can stay up for a while, and then I'll be taking that one out. Okay, so the Maafa then, all of that period is like the rape from which we are snatched from the womb of Africa. We are then transplanted into a soil which is not fertile for us. We have to understand the relationship between that and the prison industrial complex. There are many references that I can actually leave them with Professor Conyers and anybody else who's here. For instance, 3 major works, one of their friend of ours, The Criminalization of a Race by Dr. Shashi McIntyre. It's an early piece that was done on the nature of the prison industrial complex. And then, of course, we have New Jim Crow, Michelle Alexander, that people should be knowing about, reading, looking at. I'm sure there are some videos of her speaking. I don't know if she's come here to speak. She will be here, good. And then what's the other book is, or another book is Slavery by another name? Okay, I recommend all of those for this particular, because what it does is it is the continuity. It shows the relationship between things that we think are over, like this, or like chattel enslavement, when actually 2 things happen. This entire Maafa, which continues, is an attempt to erase our cultural memory. And it is within the cultural memory that any race of people, group of people, really has the means of their resistance. So it's like breaking down the resistance. So the Maafa attempts to make us orphans. And so the historical setting for what we're about to talk about is the seed being repotted, so to speak, in soil that is not friendly, to put it mildly, with its roots still in the motherland. The development of the slave codes, of the black codes, the black codes there to make us know that, don't think you're free. Don't think you are quote unquote equal. At the same time, we have the history and the spirit of African resistance. So we have the various maroon movements, organizations, that is, societies of Africans who pulled themselves out of this, escaped from it, fought, and established their own independent societies. We have many of those. There are readings that you can get, books that you can get. These would be the roots of, again, the movement in the 60s, the Dismal Swamp, various, and then some people that you would know, attempts to organize like Nat Turner, Denmark, VC, and so forth. And so, but what is happening, you have the resistance movements, and then you have what the dominant society is doing, is taking shackles from wrists and ankles and putting them on hearts and minds and spirits. And so our spirits are aching, they are hurting. I think it's West who talks about soul scars, and we have to understand these soul scars. We also have, during this period, as part of the resistance in the teens, the 1920, you have Garvey, extremely, extremely important, that goes against all of what the dominant society is attempting to do in terms of breaking the spirit of African people and dislodging us from the context of Africa and Ma'at. And so what we would do as we look at the historical setting for for the movement that comes later is look at what were the forms of control, the forms of domination, the symbols of white nationalism, because very much the movement in the 60s is about those symbols, okay? During a period of this nascent resistance, the Haitian Revolution is extremely important and inspires resistance here. Haitian Revolution is something that needs to be studied. I think it's phenomenal, where you have a people who are enslaved, seeking not just quote unquote freedom as defined by the oppressor. That's an error, big mistake, problem. But seeking sovereignty, seeking liberation and sovereignty and achieving it. That's phenomenal. And actually defeating major European nations, especially the French, of course. And so what happens here is that there is the development in these symbols of white nationalism. You get a continuation of the black codes, and you get Jim Crow, which is a term that comes from a white minstrel. You have the NAACP developing in the early 1900s, at the turn of the century, I guess, which takes a legalistic approach, mostly. And so the Jim Crow, the things that are happening during that period is a period of mind conditioning as well in terms of African people. Again, where freedom is being defined by the oppressor, in other words, them telling us what we should want. Again, what happens is when you get to people like Woodson and so forth, they're saying we need to study our history and determine our story. And so we can look at a continuing process in which that is being done. So Africana studies here would be, that would be the legacy, you see. It's a continuation of that movement, and that just got stronger and stronger and stronger. Okay, that's the background. That's context. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention, there are a lot of things that we can say historically, but I think it's important for us to also understand there's certain things that are happening from 1863 after chattel enslavement to the 1930s. We've kind of been generally looking at that. In the 1940s, you get World War II, European War II, and you have African people who are going into that war. So they're going into a different arena. They're going to Europe and seeing things, getting ideas. And that's important. It's important both in Africa, on the continent, because of then we're always looking at cross-fertilization of ideas, and we're looking at how people develop consciousness. And what happens is that on the continent, you see a direct connection with the African independence movement, which we'll talk about in a minute. And here, you get an influence as well, people coming back and having a different concept of what freedom should mean for our people, and seeing contradiction, okay, in terms of what this government here is saying and what they feel we should be experiencing as a free people. So in the 1950s, we get then the independence movements, independence so-called, in Africa. And that begins to influence us here. And so the circle is kind of reconnecting. All right? While we're watching the birthing of African nations. And it's very interesting how the cross-fertilization works, or how the circle works, because at this period, we are being influenced by what's happening there. And you know, getting a sense, being inspired by it. And then later, as the movement in the 60s develops, the reverse happens, where African people throughout the world are getting a sense of inspiration, pride, a new consciousness because of what's being done by the young people here. So that has been the nature of our movement as well, and we need to understand that. Okay, so the spirit of African resistance is spreading. It's spreading across the ocean. It's spreading across continents, you know, from continent to continent. That's a setting in which we then understand, you get the Montgomery movement, or you get things that are happening in the 50s. Now, I believe also that Robert Williams is in the 50s, right? Which is that takes a different stance than what will develop as the movement that you know of as, I call it the Southern student movement. People talk about civil rights movement and so forth. Robert Williams was talking about, he has a book, Negroes with Guns. And he was also spent time in Cuba. And so he's like way ahead. He's in a different place. And that's another stream, which when we talk about SNCC, we're not talking about until later that those come together, okay? But I'm just trying to give people a sense, and us to get together, let us get together achieve a sense of what is going on. What is the atmosphere, the environment at the period that we're talking about. So a consciousness is developing. And then in the fall of 1959, there was a person in Nashville, Jim Lawson, who was I guess in one sense you would say a follower of Gandhi, or at least philosophically believed in Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence, or his approach of nonviolence. And Jim Lawson would actually give and conduct workshops in Nashville. And so you get people like, very important person is Diane Nash. John Lewis comes as well. He's been some other places. He's been, I think, in Chicago and Illinois, going to school, and then he comes there, Bernard Lafayette. There are others that we could mention. I'm just trying to give you a background. So what's happening is that the seed is like pushing against the pod. It's you know, something is looking to happen. And a consciousness is developing, an awareness, more than an awareness, but actually beginning to look at organizations. Okay, so it's within, that's the setting for then what burst on the scene. And actually, I did want to show something here. If somebody could come and help me with this. I'm going to take this one off. Yeah, if we could, okay. Well, let me go over here.
If you want to take the mic.
I just want it to be a little graphic. You may have seen this already. Now, okay, now this, I don't even know what it's called. Yeah, that's it right there. Yeah, that's it right there. What happens is, and there should be another one. Everybody know what this is? This is the thing where it bursts outside of the sky, okay? And fertilizes. And it's like what everybody was waiting for. And this is, thank you. So if I want another one, I hit, because there's another picture with this. Oh, wait a second, that's only one? Yeah. Okay, then, well, that's not good.
Well, I mean, I just.
Oh, there it is. I think. Yeah, that's it. Okay, let's do that. Make it as big as we can. Great. All right. So this would be, I would say, the Greensboro 4. This is Greensboro, North Carolina, February 1st, 1960. Azell Blair, Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond. This is the sign that everyone was waiting for. They went back, the first day not knowing what would happen. They weren't arrested. They went back the next day. Arrests began to happen. Now, what this is, I would say, is the breaking the power of white symbolism is what's happening here, is that these young black people see the segregation signs, no colored only, and all that kind of stuff, white only here and colored there, as symbols of domination, symbols of oppression. And so, in a way that they strike against that. And so, they, in this way, touched us all. And while they were breaking the power of those symbols, they themselves became the symbols. And they became symbols of self-determination and of self-definition for all of us. I use a word in Tree language, which is a Ghanaian, spoken mostly in Ghana. And that is inconimfo, and that's warriors. So they became our warriors, a focal point for us. And they touched us all wherever we were. Well then, the people in Nashville were obviously ready for this to happen because they had already been organizing. And so they reach out and they contact this group here, which becomes more than these 4. I mean, it becomes a little movement in Greensboro. And Nashville actually becomes like an organizing core for what is to become the sit-in movement. And that's the way we refer to it. Diane Nash, very important in it. John Lewis, at one point, this is early on, they even put together, written down, the do's and don'ts of instructions for when you would be involved in a demonstration, a sit-in. And one of those things, just to help you get a sense of philosophically what's happening or what the consciousness is at that time, was you go in love, okay? People were not to physically retaliate in any way. You don't fight back. And you didn't resist arrest. You know, you didn't resist when police would come and to get you and so forth. Now, this was the beginning of what was called direct action. And so there was a code as to how you, and people would be prepared for doing that. Now, in Nashville, at this early period, they were able to desegregate hundreds of stores in a matter of months because they had such an active movement, so many students involved. And so the movement spreads. Students begin doing this all over the South. The pattern is confrontation, arrest. Confrontation, arrest. And so in 1960, by April 1960, you had sit-ins going on in 125 southern cities. Again, the modality is confrontation. They are young. They are students. And just try to imagine, because I can just remember so clearly, the effect that this is having on people in this country. That is, watching this happen. You would get hundreds of people being arrested every day. At this point, I want to say, enter Ella Baker. Remember that name, extremely important. We called her Miss Baker. This was a very humble person, brilliant person, not egotistical, not looking for any kind of personal aggrandizement. She came with ideas. She came, I wish I had a big picture. I do have a picture in this book. Hold on one second.
She's in the program.
Oh, okay, good. Look in the program.
In the program.
Everybody, very important to remember her if you're talking about this movement at all. It should look something like this. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Okay. That's Miss Baker. It's a different picture, okay. And there are this big book about her. I think there are several about her. I forgot the name of the one that I have. But she was also known as Fundi, which means teacher. Miss Baker comes, she's older, of course, than the students, and comes with a history of organization. That's important. Comes out of movement for social change, comes out of union organization, that kind of thing, okay? And what she does is, it's really, the more I think about it, it's really phenomenal, because she very quietly, this is not, she didn't do this in the newspapers, of course not on television or anything like that. She gets this idea to do this. She is then working for SCLC, and they give her a small amount of money to pull the students together. That is what she does. And she brings them together from all over the South. Now, it'd be interesting to know from people who were actually involved at that point, how did she do that? Who did she talk to? Probably, I'm sure Diane Nash, and those people were very instrumental, but you also had to go to these different areas. That's an important part of our work. It's connecting where, the disparate groups are. So at this meeting, 1960, students come from all over the South, and they also had 19 schools from the North represented. 300 students in all came. They had expected 150, if, that was their dream. Now, in this organizing, at this meeting, there are some things that they were concerned about, because what they're looking at is, how do we take this and harness this and make it into something which is going to persist, which is going to be around, which is going to become as stable as a movement can become, but something that we know is going to be there and accomplish what needs to be accomplished. And of course, that becomes one of the issues. What is it that we want to accomplish? But at any rate, there are two issues that I think are important at this first meeting. One had to do with, it was very important to the students that the Southern students who were Black would be leadership. And that those coming from the North, a lot of whom were white, just coming from the North, period, would not be in position of leadership, would not direct what was happening, would not control what was happening, but would defer to those who were actually what we call on the front lines doing this work. That was a very important thing. And so they made sure that this happened consciously. Another very important thing that she advised them on, and that was that they lead this movement. There were attempts, of course, and by the way, this would continue throughout the history of SNCC, for others to control, for others to direct, to come from the outside and to say what should happen and so forth. In this particular instance, SCLC, everybody familiar with that? That was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and that's Dr. King is associated with that, but a host of other names as well. So that has a lot of status in the Black community. They are primarily ministers. I don't know if they were all Baptists, but probably, and older, have certain kind of status and all of that. They wanted these young people to be like an arm, under them. Miss Baker said, absolutely not. She said, don't do that. Be independent, have your own organization. And the students, they're like your age, younger. I want you to get a feel for that as well, of what students at that time were doing, were thinking, were feeling, were committed to. They should lead their own organization, and this should be their organization. The first name that it had was the Continuation Committee, which I think is interesting because it points to what they wanted to make sure would happen, is that this wouldn't be a shot in the dark. Which, now that's very interesting and very important and very telling. Because do you all remember Jenna? Not too many people remember Jenna, huh? How many people? Put your hand up if you do. That's deep. When was that? What was that? We talking 3 years? And people don't know it, right? Okay, at the time, it was an incredible mobilization where there were these symbols of lynching down in, it was Alabama, right? And Louisiana. Where? Louisiana? Okay, I'm sorry. In Louisiana, I'm glad somebody knows about it. And young people reacted to that, and then were the way in which they were treated and so forth. I mean, that's quite a story. Well, there was a movement, a spontaneous movement. It erupted here in this country all over, and people took busloads down there, big thing, big mobilization, talking about it on the radio. Now, you all don't know about it. Okay? They wanted, with foresight, young as they were, to guarantee that that would not happen in this particular instance, and it didn't. It went on to form a movement, this Southern student movement, this sit-in movement, that was to affect the rest of history and to affect this entire nation. Okay? Marion Barry would be the first person who would be the head of this committee called the Continuation Committee. And I can remember, more than me here, can remember the feeling that these students in this movement gave. It was a feeling of immense pride. You had young black students making history. That's how I was feeling. I was in the North at this time. Leading their own movement. They were the vanguard. This was the image of these young people, so courageous, clear, committed. It was incredibly effective. And what I wanted to be able to share with you was that I can remember the New York Times during that period, let's say 60 to 62, 63. Somewhere in there was a period where it was so intense in terms of the sit-ins that were happening across the South by these young people and the arrests, that there was an extra section in the middle of the Times. I don't know what was happening in other cities in terms of the newspapers, but in the New York Times, you would have a section that was reporting where the arrests were, what the numbers were in what city at that time. That's how much it was capturing the attention of people in this country, and of course around the world. That was the thing. Okay. I remember that clearly, and I'm going to try to get some of that from the library. Then what happens in 1961 is at a meeting that this committee had, they are renamed, and John Lewis becomes the first chair in that instance. Okay, so now you've gone from Marion Barry to John Lewis. And the issue becomes how to keep it going, how do we maintain the momentum, how do we organize ourselves. The name becomes the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And what I want to look at now, and we're going to look at together, is how it worked. What was the structure? What were the ideas? What were the objectives? Because they were quite unique. The structure was decentralized. People with titles were not important. So the one title that I knew about was chairperson or chairman. And that person was, the press related to that. We didn't. There was no kind of authoritarian kind of thing. It was a non-hierarchical organization. That's very important. It was very participatory in terms of decision making and meetings. It was non-elitist. Now this is important. there was a rejection of any kind of elitism or any kind of superior-inferior kind of relationship, okay? Now, you got to picture this. A lot of people had, well, no, let me back up. We have to look at what was happening to our people in the South and actually in the North as well. And families, black families, African families, at that point, you are to have your child go to college was a big thing. And people would, you know, save money and saw that probably as the way to gain access, the way to become respectable. I think that would be the word. But then once you have that, then that makes you kind of superior to others of your group. And your family would say, oh, this is our first college graduate, and you know, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so think about that. Then think about, here are these young people, and they begin to leave college. Not because they are tired of school or, you know, just dropping out, doing things they shouldn't do and that kind of thing, but they do it as a conscious act to serve their people. So you are serving your people by leaving school. And you're leaving school because you want to become, the term was, put your body in the movement. That's what we used to say. That's a very different kind of image. And it's also saying that degrees in themselves don't mean anything if you are not using them to help liberate your people. This was a very radical idea at that time. But many of the people who were involved in SNCC were people who had elected to leave school for that, at least for that period of time. Or those who were in school and would come at times would not be considered as being superior to those who were not in school. You know, so education was not, academia was not something that gave you prestige or privilege. It was a reversal of that. The idea about going to prison was, here I'm doing this and it's a badge of how I am supporting my people. Which is very interesting, again, that if we compare then with now, where going to prison becomes, among some of our youth, a badge, but it is one that does not support the needs of our people. It is one that rather supports very kind of individualistic values which are not confronting the power structure of this country, which is how we saw ourselves at that time, what we were doing. Okay, so you had that.
And parents were upset.
Say it again?
Parents were upset.
Yes. You know, I was very fortunate in having parents who understood, who supported me, who wanted to see that happen. Others had to buck their parents. There was generally, however, that's something, I'm glad you said that, Dr. Wheeler. Because what I didn't mention, and I wasn't going to mention, I'm kind of taking for granted, there was a wonderful, wonderful feeling of unity among our people at that time. I don't think we've had that since. there was a clarity and there was a pride in these young people, so that we knew we were loved by our people. And so there was support of the movement by the older generations. And that's real important. This is what we are all supposed to be doing, and in some way we're all supposed to be supporting this thing that is happening. It was a very special phenomenon. Now, let me go on quickly. SNCC identified with workers, identified with farmers. That's another part of this. So it was not a where you go and you look for, okay, who's in the shirt and the tie, and let's look for who's supposed to be more middle class or upper class, or those terms are not terms that I use, but who was given focus would be what the majority, the masses were among the, we call it there was the Delta in Mississippi, but it's the Black Belt, in the South, the workers, the people who were, and they wore overalls, a lot of them. And so we wore overalls, you see? Identifying with those who were doing the hard work. And those who we would be attempting to reach. People were valued for their commitment, for their diligence in work, their sense of responsibility, their seriousness, and accountability. Those were the things that we valued people who came. And again, as I say, they would not be, impressed by somebody who came with a PhD, for instance. That was not a value, okay? So this is interesting because at the beginning, if you see the image of the college students who were doing the sit-ins and so forth, they would be in suits and ties, or the women dressed a certain way. By the time SNCC gets really, really organized and deep into organizing, everybody's wearing overalls. So that's, it shows kind of what's happening in terms of the evolution of consciousness and thinking. We definitely were not valuing what some might call the American dream. It was a redefinition of what value was. Okay? Are you taping? Okay. I think I should mention also, a rejection of control. That characterized SNCC as well. A rejection of control really by anybody, but definitely from outside. So you did not want other organizations trying to control. This is important. We're looking at method, approach. SNCC was not a membership organization. So when people tell you they were members of SNCC, that's a little questionable. It would have to be at a certain period of time, but the meaning of it is not clear, because the organization was not promoting itself, nor was it seeking to enlarge itself, to expand. So you didn't look to recruit people to be a member. What we did was, you had field secretaries, and those people were paid subsistence wage. So basically you were volunteering. And you went into what we call the local communities. And the job there was, we used to say, you work yourself out of a job. And what that meant was that it was to identify and encourage and help local people to become leaders of their own movement. That was the work of SNCC. Whereas you had other organizations, clearly, who, you know, you would get a membership card and you pay a certain amount of money per year or whatever it was. And so they could boast of, you know, all of these members. SNCC wasn't that kind of organization. It I guess, was a service, a group of young people. I mean, I remember at one point there being 30 field secretaries. Church, influenced by SCLC. Also influenced by people who had been involved in the labor movement. Now, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, was an organization that came out of the labor movement. And people need to study the labor movement because it was violent. It established a lot of precedents in terms of organization. And see, I'm not talking about the unions when they become corrupt and they represent, you know, oppression, really, which does happen at a much, much, much later period. At this early period, people, I mean, for you to be a labor organizer, you're literally taking your life in your hands. But a lot of people were, you know, that's like the place, that's the place where they get their training. And that kind of becomes an historical background for later the direct action of the movement that we talk about. And in fact, I think I want to mention here, two things begin to develop. And that is, you have direct action, and then you have voter registration within SNCC. I mean, the work that we would do. Direct action is the sit-ins. Is that direct confrontation with the authority, which the white power structure. And usually arrests. Voter registration was getting people, was in part saying, we can change this through the political structure, and if we can get votes, which in the South, black people were actually prevented from voting. So that became a symbol of the oppression of our people. And the way they were prevented was going down to, you know, you have this literacy test, which the courthouse would administer, and it was a sham. It was intentionally set up to be questions that nobody could answer. You know, the sheriff might say, what is the name of, you know, my granddaughter or something. You know, just ridiculous things like that, which you didn't know and didn't need to know. But they did that intentionally. So that part of the work became taking people, we call them taking you down to the courthouse. That was also very dangerous. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then you have at the beginning Charles Sherrod. You have the Albany movement, Albany, Georgia, who firmly believed in the philosophy of nonviolence. In the beginning, the influence on SNCC, you have the liberals of the North, you have integrationists. Belafonte was a big supporter, and I mean, you know, putting his money in to support the work. At that point, people are thinking the dream is integration on all levels. Okay, that's the ideal society, is to be integrated, black and white together. Later, then there develops a rejection of the church in a what would I say, a kind of rigid sense. Also, rejection of nonviolence. And it develops as a strategy only. You see the difference? The beginning, There were people who believed that this was right, this was the way to go, like Gandhi, that there was something redeeming in nonviolence. So it was a philosophy, and we used to make that distinction. But then what happens is that most of the people in SNCC no longer accept that as they don't believe in it. However, we still do it. You still say, you put that forward because it's strategic. When I say it's strategic, I mean that in terms of getting support from the government, you're in a better position because you're taking the position of victim. So there was a relationship with the Attorney General, who at one point was Bobby Kennedy. The federal government sending troops and things like that. They didn't send them often for us, but of course they had done that with Little Rock and, those places. But they were supporting, supposedly, the right of U.S. citizens to vote. So that's the position, that we would take. So what began to be emphasized more was political organization, was voter registration, and in Mississippi, voter registration was like direct action, because to say that you wanted to vote or to do anything like that was taking your life in your hands. To even walking into town and going to that area, going to the courthouse, black people didn't want to go to. It's very interesting because, there's some of that we have now, and it's justified. That even here in Jersey, in New York, that you got to go to the court, that's like enemy territory. But imagine what that was like in terms of Mississippi. So the movement evolved from a focus on the symbols of domination to a focus on the system of domination. And that would be one way for people to study if they want to look at this more carefully. And I would say that the third, if I move to another further point or stage of the development of SNCC, you even begin to get a interest or focus on the war against the Vietnamese people. Okay? Which very interestingly, people need to look at also the development of the concerns and thought of Martin Luther King Jr. as well, and see where it moved to. Where was it at the time of his assassination? And that's a powerful study, right there. And he was very powerful. Okay. SNCC influences other people. SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, which had previous names, and it was evolving. These are basically white students who are activists. It becomes more radical, looking at what SNCC is doing. And there's a letter from Tom Hayden. These are names probably you don't know, but they were very real to us. To the SDS leadership, talking about you need to check these people out, what they're doing, and we need to, be looking at what we're doing. SNCC later, you can see it as inspiring what become the Black Panthers. The U.S. government, everybody wanted a piece of SNCC. Everybody wanted to kind of snatch the energy or use the energy. The government wanted to co-opt it and did try to do that and to deflect kind of the energy. So you get things like the Peace Corps. You know, where you have the image of these young people going as volunteers to work for others and sacrificing the fact that they had been to college and had these degrees, but here they are willing to work for nothing and da-da-da and so forth and so on. And they become agents of, I don't mean to use agents in a bad way, but, you know, of propaganda for the U.S. abroad. Okay, now it's not accidental that this is happening while SNCC is capturing the imagination of everybody here. So it needed to compete with that, and it needed to kind of take that energy and use it in the interest of what they thought, the government thought was theirs, okay? You get the Job Corps. We don't have time now to talk about each of these things, but this is very important to know the history of this.
Yes.
Where, you know, young people are supposedly taken to a place and trained for jobs by corporations and so forth, like the corporations are doing something good. There's a book, The Choice, by Sam Yed.
Yeah.
People need to get that. What he exposes in that book is how these corporations were actually making money and getting contracts from the government under the guise of this program called Job Corps. So all of this, I'm showing the relationship between the success, the image, the energy of what SNCC is doing, what the Southern Student Movement is doing, and how people need to respond to it and try to take it over. Poverty program. You get Johnson coming in, talking about the Great Society, and then he's going to have a war on poverty. All of this is in response to the activism, the organized activism, and the appeal of SNCC. You see, that's important. You have to think how this, what effect. They don't want this to become, you know, really something that's going to change the face of this country. And there's a danger of that because it's so effective and so powerful. Got it. Anyway, SNCC becomes like an incubator, I think, for many of us, in terms of our subsequent work, our subsequent development. One of the things that it did was to expose what I call the rhetorical ethic, which Professor Kanyas can talk to you more about later. And that is, you know, saying, like with the Peace Corps, we're coming over here to really help you all and do good for you and so forth, when really there's an ulterior motive. That's what I call the rhetorical ethic. It is something which is said that is meant to disarm people who would be victims of imperialism. And the work of SNCC did that. It exposed that. It said, okay, this is the underbelly. Okay, and we're here to show you that. I want to move quickly to what I call the Mississippi story.
Excuse me, Dr. Ani. I have a class at 2. I don't want to miss this, but I have to be at my class.
Okay.
I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you.
Before I leave, I just want to say, because of you, that Dr. Khan is Director of Afrikans Studies. People need to know that when we advertised for his job, we had 65 people who applied for it. And as Assistant Director of Afrikans Studies, it was her recommendation that make sure that Dr. Khan is.
Oh, thank you. I mean, that's an honor to me. Thank you, Dr. Wheeler.
Dr. Ani, that I'm a lot of things, so
Yeah.
let's say that.
Okay.
I don't have a lot of time, right?
No, we have about 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, then I'll do this, just introduce this. The Mississippi story is a very important one, and so I'm not going to be able to do justice to it, but it is important that you know it. First of all, Mississippi was a place when people were deciding, okay, where to go or being sent places. You know, we'd go to Atlanta. The headquarters for SNCC was in Atlanta. And then you might be sent to Alabama, wherever, North Carolina, what, you know. Mississippi was not a place that people wanted to go. And people felt, you can't do anything in Mississippi. Well, a person named Bob Moses went there in 1960. He decided, I'm going, you know, to Mississippi. And very, very slowly, you see, I mean, because the fear factor in Mississippi was like huge. The activity of KKK, White Citizens Council and stuff was extremely well organized. So it was really a police state. And people felt pretty defenseless against that. But he went there and just slowly made himself known. And slowly, you know, some people came to help him. But it's so interesting because then as it evolves, because of his patient work of establishing the grounding, it pays off. And he's got this, he had a vision, he had a plan. And so he begins in 1960, nobody's there, almost gets killed, there was an assassination attempt, and you know, all of that. And then by 1964, he has this concept of bringing in hundreds, I don't know, some people say thousands, of people from the north into the state of Mississippi, and Mississippi, it reverses. So Mississippi becomes the focal point in '64. And this is under the direction and the leadership of Bob Moses. Now, the other SNCC staff, that was a decision by SNCC as well. They are pulled from different places to come and help in for what we call the summer project in the summer of '64. Now, it was controversial. I mean, it was controversial among us. I was opposed to the project. He had reason for it, and let's look at that rather than look at you know, the controversy. And that was, people were not just there just to be there, but the idea was that it was organizing a parallel political party structure to the Democratic Party in Mississippi. Okay? Because you're looking at a state where most black people are prevented from being part of the political process. And that, of course, includes the Democratic Party. Okay? They weren't letting black people in there. And they weren't choosing black people to do anything. Okay? They were keeping us out. So, what SNCC did, under the auspices of COFO. COFO was the Council of Federated Organizations. So what Bob did was to pull in other organizations. CORE, SCLC, probably NAACP as well, all working together on this project. They organized what was called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. That was a structure which allowed access and encouraged access for all of our people. So here you had something, it's like doing, you know, you have these mock UN things where children get to, it's like that. You got to do all the things that the Democratic Party was doing. You know, you go to, you have meetings, and you choose delegates, and you do all of that. And I was the director of what was called Freedom Registration. So what we would have, there was a form, and people would, you would go door to door, throughout the state and get people to sign up. That meant that we had a record of people. These were people. These were not just names, but these were people with addresses and all of that. And then to keep it short, during that summer, it was organized with all of these hands that we had to help organize. By August, which is when the parties in this country have their national, well, I guess they both do, I don't know, but certainly the Democratic Party had its national convention in Atlantic City in 1964. And we went from Mississippi and took a busload, and we took the files of the Freedom Registration. And Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who I don't have time to tell her story, but it's an important one, was the chairperson of that party, of the MFDP, and was a delegate to the convention. But of course she was elected by us. Oh, not by us, them. The people, the local people.
There.
Okay, the members of the party.
What's up?
And I think there were, I don't know, there might have been about 6 delegates. I have to look that up and see how many. And we took them all. And the idea was what was called the challenge.
Yep.
And it's very famous, infamous. They went to the convention saying we should be seated and those other people shouldn't because we are legitimate and they aren't. Now, this was very dramatic. Outside on the boardwalk, we were demonstrating. And it was soon after Cheney had been killed, along with Schwerner and Goodman. And so we had their pictures. And so they were, the delegates were attempting to be inside and to be seated as the delegates for the Democratic Party. It's quite a story which I can't go into now, but what happens is that people within the political system try to get Mrs. Hamer to accept a compromise. And she says she has become, see, this was the thing of helping local leadership to develop. I know when she started, when she first came in, and then at that point, and then later we went to Guinea together. I mean, the development of her, she's powerful in terms of a political, becoming an astute political analyst, and understanding how the system works. So that people within the party who were supposed to be quote unquote friends, like the Americans for Democratic Action, I think, Joseph Rao, they're supposed to be friends. They come and they say, you know, this is great, you've made your point, but y'all need to back off now. Because you're going to lose your support, you know, from the liberals, from and so forth and so on, because we're trying to get Humphreys to be the vice presidential candidate, and they don't want you to do this. This is it. Ms. Hamer is like not hearing none of that. She ain't feeling that. And she said, and so they're telling, so then they go back to the drawing board, then they come back and they say, okay, we got a compromise. And the compromise is that you can have 2 delegates. And she says, I didn't come here, I'll never forget her word, I didn't come all this way for no 2 seats. And what happens is, so they're just kept out. We're outside on the boardwalk. They're kept out. Some people give 2 seats, 2 tickets, rather, 2 tickets to get in, to her and Bob. They go in. So it's like sneaking in. And they sit in on the floor of the Democratic National Convention. That's an incredible thing. And I remember because if you think about it, while the convention is going on, people all over this country are watching television. So on their television, they're seeing this sit-in. It was incredible and incredibly effective. So that was like the culmination of what had happened as a result of the Freedom Summer, is that they organized the MFDP. There's so much more that I could say, but I do want to say that what becomes of this movement is that it changes the face of resistance. It changes the face of political organization. It ups the ante. SNCC itself undergoes ideological growth, and it morphs into other organizations. You have Lowndes County, which had the symbol of the panther, and then the Black Panthers are inspired by SNCC, the work of SNCC, Lowndes County, and so forth, and they take on that symbol and become, the Black Panthers. You have the Black Power movement developing out of this, which is a different kind of emphasis from, if you look back at, the sit-ins and the focus on the symbols of white authority. You now have people talking about the power structure and what it means. But you also have, so you have Black power, right? Then you at the same time begin to get the development of a consciousness that says we need to be able to study ourselves. And so you get the Black Studies movement. And within that, you get the students being activists. And on these different campuses, like here, they begin to organize for Black Studies departments, programs, and so forth. So that becomes a big movement. But all of it can be traced back to, the 60s, the sit-ins, SNCC, and so forth. Then what happens is, then you have national movements which come about. 68, 69, you get African Heritage Studies Association. You get the National Council of Black Studies. You get NABSW, which are the social workers who have their own organizations. They say there's a need. So you begin to get a thrust for independent Black, independent African organizations, which are no longer saying we want to be a part of, the white national organizations or associations, but we want to have our own. And they set up their own, which are relevant for and answerable to the Black community. So you get that going on. People begin to be influenced by Malcolm X, Dr. John Henry Clark, big influence. That's what happened to me. And so we can see the various things that they then move into. Stokely becomes, he's the chairperson before Rap Brown. So by the time Rap gets there, it's not even an issue in terms of white people and their involvement and so forth. It is an independent, Black organization. But Stokely becomes Kwame Ture. Goes to Africa, has serious training and relationship with, trying to get my years straight here, 65. Yeah, he meets before, Kwame Nkrumah. Serious. And then Kwame Nkrumah, of course, there's a coup in Ghana, so then he goes to Guinea and works closely with, and is even given a title in the government by Sekou Touré. So Stokely takes the name Kwame Touré. Okay, but also organizes, at the request of Nkrumah, he organizes the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which still exists, and does have an office in Ghana, by the way. So that's some of the things. Now, some people think they go into academia. Some people go into the conventional political process. So you get Julian Bond, you get John Lewis. Some become African nationalists, Pan-Africanists. Lester McKinney has an independent African school. He is now Baba Zulu in Washington, D.C. So it'd be interesting to see where people go in terms of you know, that development. But you do see a continuity with African Liberation Day, that kind of thing, of a consciousness which is growing in terms of connecting to Africa. And so we can see that people begin saying, we are an African people. And you have to understand that in relationship to how it evolved from the sit-in movement and from SNCC. And with that, I say thank you very much for sitting here.
Thank you, Dr. Ani. We do have a little bit of time for some questions, and if anybody has any questions, we'll take those right now. Okay, so if anybody has any questions, just raise your hand, and Dr. Ani will field those questions. Maybe 2 or 3. That's the most.
I was wondering if you could comment on the involvement of women within the SNCC movement, because it seems like it's played.
Yeah, I'm a woman, and always been in, you know, kind of, oh gosh. Let me not go there. But let's say I've never been submissive in anything. Women were, one of the things we did have, I talked about that, it was non-hierarchical. With the way things were set up, you would have projects. So you might say the Hattiesburg Project or the Greenwood Project, and very many of them were headed by women. And you had women, you know, driving trucks, I can remember so well, cars and so forth. I've heard people after the fact, talking about years and years ago, talking about women being, kept in their place, not treated well, and so forth. It was extremely, just like African cultures generally, extremely open to women as an active part of things. I mean, the names would be just, and you didn't want to mess with those women. You know, Ruby Doris Smith, Bernice was there. These were the people who ran the office. Literally. Well, one of the things I didn't mention, this may not be exactly on that topic, but when I was talking about participatory meetings and decisions, because everybody could be involved and everybody talked, everything was very emotional, and our meetings would be intense. And there's no way that women didn't, I'm not going to say they dominated, because I don't really believe in that. But they certainly were not, they didn't take a back seat, So both in terms of decision-making, participation, being vocal, but also in terms of the thinking. I was director of freedom registration for the MFDP. And also in terms of heading projects. Heading, like the head of the Greenwood project might be a woman at a particular, point. There was a lot of that. Remember that, and there weren't many people altogether. We're not talking about, hundreds of people in an organization. But there are books that you can look at, and this particular one, what is it called? You can see the women in that. Memories of the Southern Civil Rights Movement. And the fact of Miss Baker, I think, is an incredible image of Black womanhood. She's a phenomenal person. And she did not have to or want to say that she was promoting womanhood or as a feminist. And I've never called myself that, although I've always done everything. And that was the image that I had from my mother as an independent woman. But not I project myself as a Pan-Africanist. And so as part of that would be the complementarity of male and female, which is an important principle in the African world. Any other question? Any other question? Yes?
You mentioned that Ms. Baker organized and brought the groups together.
Ms. Baker?
Yeah, but why did that come about? In other
60.
Words, no, not when, but why? In other words, what was the source of that happening? Because
was seeing what was necessary as the next step. In other words, you had a pocket over here, you had a pocket over there, so the idea, look at the name of it, coordinating. The idea was the power that would come about and the seriousness of that as a movement if we were able to coordinate all these various sit-ins that were happening.
So she was already part of the movement?
She was, okay. Miss Baker, as I said, had a history as an activist and as an organizer. And it would be good there was a film that was once shown on PBS that talked about her, but there are books that also talk about her. But she worked for SCLC, and there was another organization in the Southern, I can't remember the name, but that a lot of progressive people, worked for it. That was her background.
Right.
And so she came and she said, this is what you all need to do, which what I think is foresight and brilliance.
And at the same time discouraging any formation of a connection with LCSC.
No, there was a connection. She wasn't discouraging the connection at all. What she was discouraging was their taking it over. And the young people being seen as an arm under SCLC, which is what SCLC wanted. No, she didn't discourage the connection. And we always kept the connection. But we were always, that was a problem for older people. It was a problem in March on Washington. If you remember, John Lewis was to give this speech. And they never trusted the younger people. They always felt, you're too hot-headed and it doesn't fit what our plan is, And so they got together and made him change some of the things that he was saying and there are things that you wouldn't even think were really radical, but the powers that be, and in this case the powers that be was Wilkins, Farmer, those others who were considered the respectable, whatever they were. Huh? Big Six?
Malcolm.
Them, okay, they got together, they said, hey, look, what you gonna say? No, you can't say that. And that was a big thing for us. That's when I joined, by the way. I wasn't there for the earlier part, but I was in Chicago, University of Chicago. The one thing I didn't mention was the way things would work is that you would have, in the North primarily, Friends of SNCC organizations. And their job was to raise money and to promote knowledge, awareness of the work. So people would come up, like the Freedom Singers, Bernice Reagan of Sweet Honey in the Rock. She was a freedom singer. And they would come up and they would sing and so forth, and people would get, really moved. So that was the job of the people. And I started on University of Chicago's campus, the University of Chicago Friends of SNCC. So that's the way, I got involved. But then graduated, went to the march, and then from there went south, ended up in Mississippi. Any other questions? Well, I thank you, especially those of you who stuck around.